Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines that is dedicated to those precious 6 million Jewish lives that were murdered on an industrial scale by the Nazis nearly 80 years ago. And this programme is to mark International Holocaust Memorial Day, which is Friday the 27th of January this week. And this day marks the 78th anniversary of the liberation of the Nazi death camp known as Auschwitz-Birkenau by the Soviet Red Army. And in this programme we'll be discussing, despite Holocaust education, despite that Holocaust education is in the English national curriculum, despite there are so many movies made about the Holocaust, there's so many interviews with Holocaust survivors, there are interviews in our national newspapers with survivors as well, including documentaries. Why is it that there's such a disconnect between the horrors of the Holocaust and the rise of Jew hatred? And so is Holocaust education now irrelevant? Reagan, it's great to be joining you on this difficult but important topic as we mark the 78th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is also the date, which is Friday the 22nd of January, that marks International Holocaust Memorial Day. And sadly, this is such an important topic, and yet there is a total disconnect between what happened to the Jewish people at the hands of the Nazis over 80 years ago and rising levels of Jew hatred today.
Yeah, you know, Simon, one of the things that disturbs me about this conversation is that routinely we have at International Holocaust Memorial Day and other events throughout the year to mark the particular anniversaries of the overthrow of these camps generally, or the deaths of key people involved, the key Jews who were Holocaust survivors perhaps. Is this hashtag that you see on social media, never again. Everyone's like, never again, never again. And I think there's a lot of hubris in those words when they're uttered, never again. Well, let's be honest, we've seen and are seeing very similar type language that led to the Holocaust even now. I don't think we have a full appreciation of the depths of human depravity if we are saying this will never happen again. The whole idea of the day is it's extremely important, and we can quote that saying that is, if you don't study history, you're doomed to repeat it. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But the issue is we are studying history. You quite rightly pointed out this day raises the history. We have innumerable films, you have books, you have all sorts of media, all manner of documentaries, fairly new docudramas or television shows. I think on is it Amazon, there's one called Hunters right now, which is specifically about a group of people who were going after escaped Nazis in various parts of the world. You know, all of this hones in, but there's still neo-Nazi groups. There are still people who actively identify with Hitler, from you know, popular figures like Kanye West going on live television programs saying, "I love Hitler." Literally just in the past couple of months, to other individuals, you know, talking about, suggesting that he was a good leader. I've heard that. People will say he was a good leader, or maybe not Hitler, but they'll talk about other members of the Third Reich who were instrumental. And I'm just avoiding this reality that we continue to see anti-Semitism, not just continuing to see it as it was. There's rising levels of anti-Semitism. You cannot have any retaliatory action undertaken by Israel as a nation state without having large groups of people protesting outside the Israeli embassies in various parts. Even in traditionally Israel supporting the South in the USA, in the Bible Belt region, I remember seeing people who would have grown up, I believe, in families where this would have been, you know, there would have been more pro-Israel than anything, attending essentially pro-PLO rallies in Nashville, Tennessee. of all places, all sorts of places in the Bible Belt going along with this increasing narrative by Islamic fundamentalists and individuals who want Israel wiped off the face of the earth.
Like the Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran,
Yes.
its leadership have completely vowed to destroy the only Jewish state, which would mean that the Holocaust would happen again, genocide. We have the likes of the Palestine Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, or what's left of it, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, all want to destroy the Al-Quds Force, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, all want to destroy the only Jewish state. So the fact is that what concerns me the most is the Western world. I mean, for example, you were saying before the program started that you watched, Schindler's List is probably the most famous Steven Spielberg film ever made about the Holocaust and what happened there. We have books, like mass books written on the accounts of what happened. We have interviews with Holocaust survivors, and I must have interviewed about 10 or 11 Holocaust survivors over the past decade or a bit more, which has been the greatest honor and privilege of my life to have the opportunity for them to tell their story. We've also had, for example, newspaper articles with survivors as well. And it's also on the English national curriculum, thanks to the Holocaust Educational Trust. So why is it that we are probably never been more acutely aware of the Holocaust and what happened to the Jewish people during that time? And yet there is a fundamental, unprecedented rise in Jew hatred today. And it's almost as if there is not any joined up thinking. There's no saying that these Jewish people who face this huge rise in Jew hatred today, that the Nazi ideology of the final solution was inspired and motivated by Jew hatred, and that was the whole foundation of the Third Reich and Hitler's regime, with this calls for questioning whether Israel should have a right to exist by academics, which is the only Jewish state in the world, which is nothing but anti-Semitic or Jew hatred. We're seeing attacks on Jewish students at university campuses and others, and we're seeing that the Jewish community feel vulnerable. And now for the first time really in the last decade, American Jewry really for the first time is feeling the hate of Jew hatred as the world is turning against the Jewish people again, as it's turning against the nation of Israel. And there doesn't seem to be a connection between what the Nazis did and who the Nazis were, and those same ideologies that hate the nation of Israel and the Jewish people today, but also the need to speak up and say never again.
Let me say something that I think helps clarify where we have arrived at in this point in time in history, because all of this is built on the foundation of Jew hatred in the past. Of course, we know that. And you can see a track record of individuals, statesmen, politicians, rulers, you name them, who spoke in extremely violent ways about the Jews. I think you can look at Roman Catholicism as having a hand in this. Look at some of the nations that have been most clearly anti-Jewish. You can think of the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition eradicated Jews essentially from Spain, or forced conversion. You can look in our own nation as well, where a very large number of Jews died in York as a result of extreme violence against them. They committed mass suicide actually in the tower in the center of York rather than be executed and humiliated.
Of course,
publicly.
the expulsion of the Jews by Edward I in 1290.
Absolutely, and tragically, we see that a lot of this was done in the name of Christ. And could I suggest it's because the Roman Catholic gospel is not the true gospel, and it has this idea of the Jews being the Christ killers. This presentation, this blood libel is what it's called, the Christ killers. Okay, well, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be right with God were it not for Jesus giving up his own life. He said, "No one takes it from me; I give it up myself." Also, conveniently ignores the extreme part the Gentiles had in Christ's crucifixion, but there's a very large bit of responsibility there. Okay, well, what about the Protestant nations? Remember, Catholicism up to 1600s is very heavily responsible. But then Martin Luther particularly was influential, inarguably. I'm going to say this because I've had people push back when I've talked with them directly about it. Martin Luther was inarguably a promoter of Jew hatred. Initially, not so. But eventually, especially in the last quarter of his life, he demanded really that Christians burn the households, belongings, and whatnot of Jews. Absolutely reprehensible. Did God use Martin Luther? Yeah, he uses all things together. He works everything together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So just to put a little bit of a different angle on this, Simon, I think that we have to go a long way back in history and recognize a lot of the anti-Semitism is deeply embedded in society. Look at a nation like Ireland, which is generally very supportive of PLO, right? Okay, Roman Catholic.
And the EU as well, yeah.
Exactly. Very Roman Catholic. Look at across Europe, where you have in France, Spain, Portugal, these places, extreme anti-Semitism. My goodness, I've taken my wife to Spain before, and you can't walk anywhere in some cases without seeing a swastika that someone has daubed on some wall. So you're looking at nations that they're deeply embedded in this blood libel terminology that's completely unbiblical, that's completely anti-Jewish, completely anti-Christ. Okay, it's the same in Germany, it's the same in Austria, it's across the board. That's not to say that everyone in these places by any means. Let me point to the south of the USA. Okay, why did the USA not want to get involved in World War II? Because there were many German sympathizers, Nazi sympathizers in the United States. The KKK was extremely anti-Jew. And tragically, many of these people professed Christ. So, it's all fine and well to look outside, to look externally. As a Christian pastor, I want to leave a challenge to Christians that if you are anti-Jew, you are anti-Christ, okay? Because he is the Messiah of the Jews.
Absolutely. And also I've got to mention the fact that President Roosevelt at the time as well prevented Jewish people from escaping the horrors of Nazism in Europe and closed their borders. Britain closed their borders. We had the Evian conference, I think in 1938 in France, in which Hitler said the only solution to the Jewish problem is the final solution. Of course, that was developed by the Nazi regime as the Second World went on. But there can be no doubt that the very heart of the Nazi regime was the extermination of the Jewish people. And as we mark the 78th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the biggest Nazi death camp in Poland by the Soviet army, it's important that we remember what happened. So let's have a look at this excellent CBN News report.
Tourists have not visited Yad Vashem for nearly a year because of the COVID-19 pandemic, yet Shaya Ben Yehuda, managing director, opened the memorial to tell its story.
Yad Vashem's name is coming from the book of Isaiah, the message that each of those people who perished during the Holocaust should be remembered.
The memorial traces the story from before World War II through the horrors of the Holocaust.
My mother was born in Germany. She grew up before Hitler came to power, but she witnessed what happened in Germany when Hitler came to power. As years moved forward, reality got worse and worse for the Jews.
Ben Yehuda lost many of his family in the Holocaust.
We cry for what happened to humanity, what happened to those who were created by the image of Lord.
Mass murder took place on an industrial scale at the hands of the Nazis.
How they took the decision to destroy life. How they have decided that Jews are subhuman that have no right to exist.
6 million perished. Yet some stood with and saved Jews who are remembered at the Avenue of the Righteous among the nations.
Righteous among the nations are non-Jews who put their own life in risk in order to try and help Jews during the Holocaust. They were not bystanders, they didn't turn their back.
Yet Ben Yehuda says the lesson of the Holocaust is a lesson for today.
Wherever you see anti-Semitism or any other hatreds, please stand up.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Yad Vashem Memorial, Jerusalem.
It's a very difficult visit, but if you do find yourself in Jerusalem at some point, I hope that you'll make the time to go to Yad Vashem. It is important history and gives a lot of crucial perspective on this.
Yeah, and also what's so remarkable about the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, Yad Vashem, is you go on a journey where you look at the Jewish communities in Europe, and what you notice then is their life before the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, and their life as the German Nazi forces advanced their invasion plans across Europe. You see that they targeted the Jewish community and essentially murdered 6 million Jewish people out of 8 million. But at the end of the museum, there is an incredible light as you look at the forests surrounding Jerusalem, and that Israel is a source of redemption today for the Jewish people. Reagan, if we can go to, for example, I just want to read out a little bit of this one. So this year will be the 78th anniversary since the Red Army liberated Auschwitz, the largest of all the Nazi death camps, where in Auschwitz-Birkenau, over 1 million Jewish people were murdered by the Nazis on an industrial scale. During the Second World War, the Nazi regime was responsible for the mass murder of over 6 million Jewish lives, the greatest act of genocide in human history. And the Russian Red Army found at Auschwitz 88 pounds of sunglasses, hundreds of prosthetic limbs, 20,000 pots and pans, and 40,000 pairs of shoes.
Yeah, Simon, as we consider International Holocaust Memorial Day, we have to recognize it's the defining moment in human history. It continues to shape a lot of European society. A lot of our discussions over this raises challenging questions about human behavior. I look at it, we've talked about this before, as a very fundamentally spiritual issue. I believe, of course, please don't misunderstand me, that the Nazis were responsible for their crimes and for their sin against the Jews, but I do believe that they were under an immense satanic delusion. I don't see how you can have a whole society give in to such hatred and the sort of propaganda that was being pushed out, buying into that, apart from a real satanic blindness.
Oh, you only have to look at the SS and realize that the SS were obsessed with the occult. Hitler himself was also obsessed with the occult. And of course, when we know that, when we look at this spiritually, we know that Satan hates the Jewish people. He always has. You have a look at the way that throughout the Old Testament, for example, the Pharaoh that came to power during the time of Moses didn't remember Joseph, and therefore saw the Jewish people as a threat and wanted to ethnically cleanse the Jewish people. We have the story of Esther and Mordecai, where the ancient Persian Empire under Haman want to destroy the Jewish people. And again, we see this repeatedly in world history. Now, we've got a news report to go to that is a couple of years old, where world leaders are vowing never again in terms of rising Jew hatred. But in 2023, are their words beginning to sound a little hollow?
Mm-hmm.
They called it Remembering the Holocaust, Fighting Anti-Semitism.
The Jewish people have learned the lessons of the Holocaust, always to take seriously the threats of those who seek our destruction, to confront threats when they are small, and above all, even though we deeply, deeply appreciate the great support of our friends, to always have the power to defend ourselves by ourselves.
Resulting in the largest diplomatic event in Israel's history, leaders including Britain's Prince Charles, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, Russian President Vladimir Putin, and German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier came to Jerusalem to say, never again.
We must be prepared to confront and expose the vile tide of anti-Semitism that is fueling hate and violence all across the world, and we must stand together.
The spirits of evil are emerging in a new guise, presenting their anti-Semitic, racist, authoritarian thinking as an answer for the future, a new solution to the problems of our age. And I wish I could say that we Germans have learned from history once and for all. But I cannot say that when hatred is spreading.
Ahead of the event, a special European delegation visited the site where Nazis perpetrated so much evil and hatred. The leaders brought the delegation here to Auschwitz to emphasize the fact of what happens when anti-Semitism goes unchecked. Born in Poland, former Israeli Chief Rabbi Israel Meir Lau is a Holocaust survivor.
Anti-Semitism is something you can explain, but you cannot find a reason for it. It's against dialogue. It's against logic. It's a spiritual madness.
Before the Red Army liberated the largest Nazi death camp 75 years ago, Nazis murdered an estimated 1.1 million Jews at Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Combating anti-Semitism is not only a question of politics and statements and whatever comes out in the media, but it's an actual fight for our safety in Europe.
Rabbi Shlomo Kovesh said the Jewish people need a plan to fight anti-Semitism and what he called mutations of this virus.
And we have to partner with those politicians, opinion leaders, public figures that are ready to partner with us in our war against anti-Semitism. It's a war of minds, it's a war of ideas, and we need a lot of partners for this war. And we have to look at it as a war.
Rabbi Menachem Margolin made clear their goal must be to put action behind the words, never again.
To really measure the success, we'll need to follow up and see how many of those MEPs will sign and promote the draft legislation we presented yesterday to ensure that children in Europe will get more education, that the trade of Nazi memorabilia will be banned, and the use of any anti-Semitic stereotypes will be banned.
And banning anti-Semitism isn't just good for the Jewish people.
God told Abraham that I will bless whoever blesses you and curse whoever curses you. And we see that throughout our history of human civilization, that whoever persecuted the Jews later on was devastated and destructive.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem and Auschwitz, Poland.
It's incredibly important that we continue to observe and continue to remember this particular day, Simon, even though, as we've discussed and as the topic of this program is, there's a rise in Jew hatred, which also means there does need to be extra security. I mean, this is part of the issue. We see synagogues needing special security, Jewish schools needing special security, even particular members of the Jewish community. I think of Stamford Hill, which is not too far from where I live, and there has to be their own essential security throughout Stamford Hill. And if, I believe it's Shamron is what it's called, if they're not involved in overseeing the communities, sometimes the police won't do anything.
Or Community Security Trust as well, that provides protection of the Jewish community. They also provide reports on anti-Semitism, academic reports, and they are there to safeguard the Jewish community. But I mean, can you ask me what other religious minority in this country need fortresses in order for their children to go to school? They need metal detectors and metal surveillance equipment. When children go to school, they've got to put their bags through an X-ray machine before they can get to school. What other religious minority has security guards outside of their places of religious worship? And if we go to Europe, and having before done the European report, going to Brussels once a month, you literally saw Belgian paratroopers with machine guns outside the Jewish Museum, outside the ancient synagogue in Brussels, and of course in Paris as well. And you know, in the West, there can only be so long that the Jewish community can tolerate that, because yes, they are provided for protection, and usually they're spending huge amounts of their own wealth and resources within their own Jewish communities for their protection, and yet no other religious minority needs that form of protection. Yes, there are extreme elements at times, occasionally, when other religious communities are attacked, but not on the scale that the Jewish community faces. And going back to the importance and significance of Yad Vashem, I mean, my first time to Yad Vashem was in '96 when I was 21. I was part of the program I did through the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And I remember going around, and the museum's nothing like it was today. There was a railway carriage. I remember just literally on a hill, on the edge. It was one of those cattle trains that would have transported the Jewish people from various places in Europe to the Nazi death camps. And it was a chalk, and it said, "If you see my son Ronnie, tell him that I L-O," and that was it. Died before she could finish writing what she wanted to say to her son. And that just brings the memories home of how horrific this is and how demonically motivated Jew hatred is. And as Christians, we can't tolerate that at all. Now, we also have to commend the excellent work of the Holocaust Educational Trust that have made International Holocaust Memorial Day such an important day.
Yeah, the theme for 2023 is ordinary people. It particularly invites people participating in this special remembrance to consider persecuted people, and particularly the Jews in the Holocaust, as ordinary people living their ordinary lives. In the words of a Romanian French poet and Holocaust victim, Benjamin Fontaine, the theme encourages us to remember that those murdered in the Holocaust were innocent, and that each too had a face marked by rage, by pity and joy, an ordinary human face. It's difficult. We so often, Simon, distance ourselves. It's easier. It's a coping mechanism. We distance ourselves from the personality of it. I think that's what that film Schindler's List with Spielberg tapped into, in that one particularly moving scene where you see the little girl, no more than 4 or 5 years old probably. It's a black and white film, but she has red shoes. And
a red dress and a red balloon.
Exactly, and you see her, she stands out, and then it highlights, you just see in the film a little bit of her journey, and then you suddenly see in the stack of bodies and clothes the red shoes, and you realize what's happened to this little girl. It's difficult to step into that situation of what it would have been like. It's very easy to depersonalize, but I think what we actually need to do is to start personalizing it and to start stepping into those shoes, so that we can see the horror of it, and so that we can avoid the mistakes in the present.
Absolutely, and our guest for the program before we interviewed him today, Zelmi Unsdorfer, was sharing us how Israel and Yad Vashem are doing an exhibition in the United Nations in which they've been able to name 4.8 million of the Jewish people that were murdered at the hands of the Nazis, which is incredible. Identifying 4.8 million people who had a name attached to themselves, and it's just extraordinary. The size of the Jewish community in Europe prior to the Second World War compared to what it was after the Second World War, and to think that no other. The Jewish people have never faced such darkness, such evil in their history as they faced in the Holocaust, and no other people group have ever faced such a systematic desire for destruction of what the Nazis wanted to do. It's
very significant that the national curriculum in England, and by law, children are to be taught about the Holocaust as part of Key Stage 3 history curriculum. It's the only historical event whose study is compulsory on the national curriculum, which is interesting. And, you know, as an aside, I saw that recently with the Abraham Accords and a greater normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia and some of the other Emirate nations, that they're actually, for the first time, going to begin teaching about the Holocaust in those countries, which is massive. But it also says something a little bit about the avoidance of the subject over past decades. And yet we still have this problem that is there with Jew hatred. We still have a problem with this education, you know, the system going as it is. Independent schools are not obliged to deliver the national curriculum, but many do.
We're now joined by my good friend and a leader in the Jewish community, as well as being the chairman of Likud Harut. His name is Zelmi Unsdorfer, currently in Jerusalem, but he's also the son of a famous Holocaust survivor, Simcha Unsdorfer, who wrote the famous book, The Yellow Star. Zelmi, it's always a pleasure to interview you, especially as you're in Jerusalem. As we mark the 78th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau by the Russian Red Army, and we mark International Holocaust Memorial Day, what does this day mean to you?
Clearly, it's important that this is marked for the future generations, and obviously the target has to be the younger generations. It's just, I find a great sadness that the rise in anti-Semitism today is very markedly prevalent in the campuses, in the university campuses. And I think the importance of marking this occasion has to be matched by action by university dons and the faculty of these institutions to apply zero tolerance to this kind of thing, and to make sure that the true history of this Holocaust, I would call it the industrialized genocide of the Jewish people, is remembered and taught in its full color.
Absolutely. And Zelmi, your father was famous for this incredible book, and I've read it. It's absolutely inspiring and inspirational of how your father, Simcha, survived the Nazi genocide. Can you share a little bit with us about your father's remarkable story and the book he wrote, detailing his horrible accounts at the hands of the Nazis?
He was taken with his parents, his mother and his father. He was 19 years old. His father was a rabbi, and they were taken from Czechoslovakia in a cattle train to Auschwitz. My grandparents were killed on the same night of arrival. My father, at 19 years old, escaped selection for death, even though he didn't look particularly healthy specimen at the time. And during one selection by the notorious Dr. Mengele, the angel of death, my father was pushed forward in a line of people so that the whole selection line collapsed in a heap. And by the time they, after a screaming Mengele said, "Start again," by the time they'd started again, they had changed my father's appearance, taken his glasses off, and put a beret on his head. And as a result of that, he survived, and that's why I'm speaking to you today.
Very powerful, emotional story, Zelmi. Tell us, over the centuries, we've seen vile propaganda against Jews that have sparked hate crimes right and left, and that were a big part of the Third Reich's policy against the Jews. We're seeing, I believe, at the moment, an increase in conspiracy theories, similar propaganda. What can we learn from those days leading up to the horrors of Auschwitz and indeed other camps in our watching of the situation today?
Well, I find it. Look, at the time, my father and his parents and his cousins and brother-in-law and so forth, many members of the family, and also my mother's family, were being killed in Auschwitz and other camps. We were just Jews. We were stateless people, a minority people who were, had suffered pogroms and all kinds of, the Spanish Inquisition and so forth throughout the ages. Now that we have the State of Israel, it's a different paradigm, because now Israel is the Jew amongst the nations, and it is discriminated as a country, just the same way as a Jew was discriminated by the peoples of the world. So, for example, you will see that 90% of the resolutions of the United Nations are against Israel, whilst countries all over the world are oppressing their people and carrying out all manner of chemical and other horrific acts, and they get off with with barely a slap on the wrist. I was thinking today that we're just coming up to 1 year of the war in Ukraine. Tens of thousands of people have been killed in the most horrific way, indiscriminate bombing and rocketing by Russia. There has not been, and I live in London, there has not been one demonstration outside the Soviet embassy protesting this. But if Israel responds to a missile attack, an indiscriminate missile attack from Gaza, and thereby wishes to defend itself, 20,000 people will show up in Knightsbridge outside the Israeli embassy. This sums it up, really, for me.
Yeah. And Selmy, I've got to ask you this very, very difficult question regarding Holocaust education. I mean, in terms of Holocaust education, we have the Holocaust documentaries on our TVs. We have films like the Holocaust, Schindler's List and others. We have interviews with Holocaust survivors. Our national newspapers are full of interviews with the Holocaust survivors. It's in the English national education system. And yet, is Holocaust education now irrelevant, because we're seeing a huge rise, unprecedented rise, in Jew hatred across the Western world? And there seems to be a total disconnect between what happened to your father and your family during the Second World War at the hands of the Nazis, and a connection between that and the challenges the Jewish people face across the world with this increase in anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism will never go away. Anti-Semitism is the most illogical hatred, because if you actually think about it, you would assume that if any part of society, if any people or group of people managed to provide so much to the world in terms of 20% of the Nobel Prizes and the movie industry and arts and sciences, Einstein, all kinds of medical discoveries, you name it, the mobile phone, Waze, the navigation, all these things that the Jews have given to the world, you would think that they would be considered to be a valued member of any society. And you would think that the only people for whom anger should be directed and hatred should be directed are people who bomb buildings and crash airplanes into skyscrapers and so forth. And yet it's completely the opposite way around. It's completely the opposite way around. And you never see a demonstration against Iran, which is sponsoring all this terror. You see them every 5 minutes over Israel. So I think it's more than just creating monuments to the Holocaust. The history of the Nazi Holocaust is there for people who want to research it. I think what's important is to outlaw the hate speech on campus and try to have an impression on the next generation. That's what's the most crucial part.
Absolutely. And Zelmi, can you just share with us what Christians can do to stand up to this rising level of Jew hatred that we're seeing today, which was the main ideological reason why the Nazis carried out the final solution, and something that we should not tolerate or accept? And also, what role can Christians play in terms of Holocaust education and getting the message out that this should never, ever happen again, particularly not on our watch?
Well, coming back to the campus scene, I would say that Christian groups should 100% be applying pressure on the faculty and of universities and campuses to make sure that this is absolutely dealt with zero tolerance, because it is nothing other than baseless hatred, and needs to be eradicated. They also should encourage more Jewish societies and Israel societies to be set up on campus so that people, young people, actually feel they've got a safe place, a safe space to operate, instead of being frightened, literally frightened, to walk around campus with a Star of David on their neck, or even other signs of Jewish identity. That's, I think, the most useful thing that they could do. Obviously, other than applying pressure on their congressmen, where Christians are citizens of the United States.
Zalmi, I just want to thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Headlines to mark International Holocaust Memorial Day. Our thoughts and our prayers are very much with you during this very, very difficult time. And we just thank you so much for your father's remarkable book. Here it is, The Yellow Star.
Thank you, Simon.
Pleasure.
I definitely encourage you to find a copy of that book, The Yellow Star, and read it and learn from it. Just on the back cover here, there's a quote talking about the different ways that people approached the death camps. And there's one particular way in which you just allow yourself to lose all forms of decency and character and integrity. The other, though, he writes, was to hang on to dear life by trying to find hope and courage beyond human power. And there were plenty who adopted the law of the jungle, and they became the terror of the camp. I and many like me preferred to adopt the old and tested Jewish method of finding hope and strength in God and in prayer to Him. And thus every morning and evening, 15 or 20 of us crouched together quietly between the bunks to recite some parts of the prayers and then go to work or to sleep, encouraged by the knowledge that the God for whose sake we suffered was listening to our pleas.
Yeah, can I just share one of the most remarkable stories in that book? And I definitely recommend reading it. It's compelling reading and it deserves to be read. Is the fact that Zalmi's father, Simcha, and his group of friends in one of the Nazi death camps risked everything to have a Hanukkah celebration where they lit the candles under the cover of darkness. Now, if the Nazi guards had discovered what they were doing, that's instant execution. And yet they did it to keep their Jewish identity. And this is the thing I think we tend to forget when it comes to the Holocaust, is that the Nazis wanted to strip everything of the Jewish people, and all they were left was a number tattooed on their arm, which means that they stripped them of their identity, they stripped them of their professions, they stripped them of their family, and they stripped them of their humanity. And all they were left with was a number to make them different from anyone else. And that was what was also so horrific about the kind of Nazi regime. And I also think that we, as time has gone on, particularly, we're around approaching the 80th anniversary in 2 years' time at the end of the Second World War, that all these horrific events happened over 80 years ago. I think it's also important that we have to remember, for example, how vile the Nazi regime was. While I was ill, I was watching a documentary on the History Channel regarding the Battle of the Bulge, for example, and the Nazis had captured like 30 American soldiers. They rounded them up, put them in a field and massacred them. There was one town in Luxembourg, which is what the Nazis wanted to attack, and the American forces were in this chateau and be able to push back that Nazi offensive. So the Nazis used chemical weapons on the American forces and then used flamethrowers to get them out. So, I mean, the Nazis, I think, were absolutely vile, and they would stop at nothing, absolutely nothing, to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. And I think it's important to remember in this time where there's a lack of concept of what evil is. What we saw with the Nazi regime was pure evil, from its fighting force of the Wehrmacht to the SS, and also, of course, the biggest crime ever committed by the Nazis was the final solution.
And they actively used drugs as well to give them greater endurance, greater strength, and to suppress their emotions and any degree of conscience. So this only amplified they were able to spread throughout Europe with such pace as a result against so many odds perpetrating their evil wherever they went, but also their teaching, their ideology awakening in many people some sort of maybe previously suppressed Jewish hatred, because we can't forget that across Europe there was widespread Jew hatred, and there was kind of this liberation under the Third Reich to manifest that to some degree.
And of course the Nazis couldn't have done that with themselves. I mean, they needed the support of the German people. Then they needed the support of the nations they occupied, like Poland and the Ukraine, in order to carry out the systematic roundup and then the murder of the Jewish people. And a brilliant film to watch on this one is Defiance. You know, one of the greatest privileges that I've had in over a decade of working for Revelation TV is the opportunity to interview Holocaust survivors and hear their incredible stories of courage and their incredible stories of survival against all odds against the Nazi regime. And this is a wonderful interview that I did last year on the Middle East port with a wonderful Israeli called Shai, who survived the Holocaust. His wife is also a Holocaust survivor, but he also was an Israeli navigator in the Israeli Air Force and carried out so many combat missions to defend Israel against the Arab states who wanted to annihilate Israel. So let's have an extract of the interview that I did with this remarkable Holocaust survivor.
Well, we were a very rich and Zionist family, also in a way a little bit religious. I was all the time watched by a German nanny that was brought from Danzig to Warsaw, and everything was forbidden. I couldn't touch this, I couldn't run, I couldn't make anything which she didn't want. And I was the youngest son of 2 brothers and 2 sisters. My eldest brother, when I was the age of 4, came back from Italy as a surgeon to Poland. Between me and him, there was a difference of 31 years. And he was working in a hospital in Warsaw. I had a very good time, and of course, as a difference between my brothers and my sister and myself, age-wise, I was a spoiled child, a very spoiled child. And I remember only good things from that period until the 1st of September 1939, when I was 5 years old.
And what do you remember then on the 1st of September with...
Well, first of all, I remember that my father and my 2 brothers, they escaped from Warsaw because my father knew that he was on the blacklist of the Germans. So even before they started to fight, he escaped already from Poland to the Russian part of Poland, because there was an agreement between Russia and Germany to divide Poland, and he escaped to the Russian part of Poland. And I stayed with my mother and my 2 sisters in Warsaw in a beautiful house with a beautiful cellar. And I remember the bombardment that started on the 2nd or the 3rd of September 1939. And on the 22nd, and we were, of course, when the bombardment started in the cellar, because there was everything in that cellar. And on the 22nd of September, the Germans conquered Warsaw. We went back to our house from the cellar. I looked out of the window. I saw already German troops, Nazi, SS, Gestapo. And one thing that I didn't understand actually then what it means, but I saw a Jew with peot, which I don't know how you call it in English, walking the street, and two Germans, I don't know if they were Gestapo or SS, came and started to cut his beard and his peot. For me, it was a game. I was a child. And actually, this game, I was playing with a friend of the other house, also a Jew, my age. Once he was the Gestapo and I was the Jew, and once he was the Jew and I was the Gestapo, we were cutting actually the peot and the beard onto the other. So for us, it was a game. But the situation started, I actually do not remember because I was 5 years old, but the situation started to be very bad. There was no problem of food because we had everything we needed. And suddenly, a man came into our house, he spoke to my mother, and after about 2 weeks, we went down from our house with only few things. It was around middle of November, end of November, bitter cold already in Warsaw, on a carriage with 2 horses, and we started to drive out of Warsaw. And this is the last time that I saw Warsaw before the end of the war, only after the end of the war. We came, my mother was not a strong woman. She was a little bit in physical bad conditions. And we started to move with that carriage through woods, bitter cold. We had something to eat. We came to a river, so we had to go down. And I remember that the water it was not a river, it was a small kind of river. I remember that the water came over my knees, and my mother it was very difficult for her to walk, very difficult. On the other side of the river stood another carriage and brought us to a city in White Russia, Belarus, which was called Baranovichi. Then I met my father and my 2 brothers. And my father rented a certain place to live, nothing to compare with what we had in Warsaw. But I played, and I didn't feel yet anything which was going on in the future during the war.
Real life history right there. Thank you so much, Simon, for that very helpful interview. And I do pray that viewers, maybe you can go back and look at some on the website, on YouTube, of those interviews that have been done over the years. You tune in regularly on Revelation TV. We have interviews with Holocaust survivors. There have been programs where we've talked about this. Behind the Headlines Middle East Report, I believe, was that was where that interview was. But it's so important that we as Christians make ourselves aware, that we educate ourselves of this history, and that we ourselves speak out against Jew hatred wherever we see it.
Reagan, thank you so much for doing this program on this somber day as we mark International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And we want to thank you for watching this program at home. Holocaust education is important, but it's only important is if we stand up to the rise of Jew hatred that we're seeing today. If we speak up against it, we say we're not going to see this in our name. We're not going to see the Jewish people attacked and defamed as they were in the 1930s and 40s. That way, we are making sure that this never happens again. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind Headlines as we mark International Holocaust Memorial Day.